orchestrated all this. That's where the real problem is.
Let's move over to NATO, if we may, because, of course, it's just been celebrating its 70th anniversary, the organisation, and NATO's announced it's going to boost its presence in the Black Sea. At the same time, Washington has ordered Russia to leave Venezuela. Is there some kind of contradiction there? It seems like the US feels it can go wherever it wants, NATO can go wherever it wants, Russia can't.
Well, that's the way it seems, and I think what you just described is one of the reasons we as libertarians have defended the position that we don't need to be in NATO, and NATO doesn't need to exist. And the libertarian-leaning politicians back in 1949 said don't get involved because it would stir up more trouble, that there would be more challenges toward Russia and more likely to have trouble.
Hours before the NATO anniversary, the US Vice President hit out at Germany over its level of defence spending. Obviously, it wants the Germans to spend more. Also criticised Turkey for buying arms systems from Russia. So NATO, if it's an alliance, it's not getting the friendliest of hosts in the US.
No, and that once again is a problem of, excuse me, of too much intervention and anticipating and trying to make everybody happy. So I think that the biggest problem is the organization. And the reason I argue for the case of, getting out of NATO.
Okay, Ron, I can see you. I know I've been there myself. You have a good drink. Just take a moment and have a drink. I know what it's like. It's awful when you're having a bit of trouble. Yeah, we all get parched from time to time. To what extent do you think being part of NATO means having to go along with whatever America wants? It's pretty clear. America is the boss of this gang, for want of a better expression. Does that mean all the other members have to go along with what the US says, or do they have any power to argue back?
Yeah, well, I think they're naive for going along. They think they get benefits, and they do. They get monetary benefits. I've argued that our foreign policy is designed to say that if you do what we tell you, we'll give you a lot of money. If you don't, you better watch out. We might put on sanctions or bomb your country. And I think there's too many countries, especially the European countries, say, well, we can't defend ourselves, and we don't want to have to spend this money. It's a big benefit. You send troops over here, you spend money here, you give us aid, and you also provide so-called defense in case anybody would ever attack us. So I think it's detrimental to them, but it's sort of like a spoiled kid. They don't take care of themselves. So they think they're getting a good deal, but ultimately I don't think they should, because we're going to run out of the ability to take care of everybody, and I think that's what gets to Trump sometime as well. He said let's get out of NATO, but I think what he's tired of is maybe the bills piling up and trying to argue that other countries should pay more. But I think it's the principle that I'm concerned about, the principle of an international organization that gets us involved and badgers other countries and pressures them to support us in what we do around the world, whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq or Libya or Syria or wherever. Certainly in Ukraine, we were looking for support. So they give us token support for us managing our empire. And that's where the real problem is. I think the countries that go along with it, are getting a little bit concerned, because you take the Iranian situation, with breaking off of the treaty with Iran, the Europeans aren't exactly happy with that. They'd be much better off saying, hey, what's wrong with us trading with Iran? And there's a lot of us who say, what's wrong with trading with Russia? Why do we have to have these unnecessary squabbles? And so now it's back and forth and back and forth. And if we do something, the other countries have to respond to us. So I think that interventionism breeds this kind of stuff. And that's why we argue the case that we ought to mind our own business. And people say, well, you'll just be an isolationist. Well, it's opposite of isolationism. We don't want to be by ourselves, but we want to talk to people. Why we were really happy with 89-90, with the breakdown of the Cold War, getting rid of that. That meant we could talk to and travel and trade with Russia. And now, of course, things are backing off from that because, to keep the military-industrial complex going and keep the agitation, you always have to have an enemy. And some people, and I think it's the minority, I think the average person in this country, why make an enemy? But anyway, that's part of our policy, and that justifies all this expenditures. And so what I think will happen is the inability of our country to afford what we're doing, which is really was detrimental to the Soviet system. They thought he couldn't afford it. But we're getting to that point too, and I think a lot of people are getting frustrated with what you described, us getting involved and imposing and telling them what to do, and us bossing ourselves. But I don't think that's going to last forever. As a matter of fact, I see some cracks in that already.
Well, I mean, perhaps one of the cracks was Donald Trump saying not that long ago, in a surprising statement, that the US, China and Russia should start spending less on their militaries and use the money for something more worthwhile. Do you think he really meant that? But then, of course, there's the stumbling block he's going to hit, well, more like a wall, if you'll excuse me for using a sensitive issue when it comes to Trump, is that military-industrial complex you talked about.
I'd be a genius if I could answer and say, I know what he really meant, because some days we cheer him on and some days we say, hey, why are you doing this? Because in the meeting he was in the other day, he sort of blurted out, why can't we be friends with Russia? And some of his colleagues were looking, what did he just say? And sometimes I think that's where Trump really is coming from. But unfortunately, he still has to contend with some pressure coming from the deep state and the neoconservatives. They seem to still have tremendous power and influence on our government, and they seem to be able to control Congress as well.
Ron, it's always good to speak to you. The man a lot of people say, the best politician never to be US president. Good to speak to you, Ron. Ron Paul, former US congressman. The president of Brazil has caused widespread outrage during a visit to a Holocaust museum in Jerusalem. On an official visit to Israel, Jair Bolsonaro offered up some unconventional views on the political leanings of the Nazi Party.
There is no doubt it's a socialist party.